Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel Storm, and I work at History Colorado, our state's history museum. Today we're going to talk about what life was like for Japanese Americans living in Colorado during World War II. Japanese Americans are American people, but they, or their grandparents, or their great-grandparents, or their great-great-grandparents came to the United States from Japan. The first Japanese people moved to Colorado from Japan more than 130 years ago. Many of them were farmers, but some were businessmen who owned grocery stores and other places where Japanese Americans bought the things they needed. And some worked on the railroads, so trains and people could get from place to place. Around 100 years ago, over in the country of Japan, the people there wanted to become really powerful in Asia, so they started fighting with other countries nearby, like a bully on the playground taking toys from other kids. The first country they began to fight with was China. But then they decided to attack the United States. Hawaii was the place in the United States that was closest to Japan. So the Japanese attacked America's military at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. After being surprised by the attack, America decided to fight back against Japan. All of the battles between Japan and the US happened in the Pacific Ocean, in Asia, or in Japan. But back in the United States, some Americans began to worry about Japanese people coming to fight them. And they started picking on Americans who looked like the Japanese people because those people's moms and dads or grandmas and grandpas had moved to the United States from Japan many years before. They wondered, could I tell the difference between Japanese people and Japanese American people? These two men lived in Japan and were Japanese, and they speak Japanese. Konnichiwa, watashi wa Nihonji desu. Hello. I am Japanese. These people looked the same, but they were Americans. They lived in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. Hello, I am an American. Some of them spoke Japanese too. Konnichiwa, watashi wa Amerikajin desu. Hello, I am an American. But they were still Americans. Some people called Japanese Americans bad names and broke their belongings. Then, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed a document called Executive Order 9066 that said all Japanese Americans living in California and Oregon and Washington had to move away from their homes because those were the states closest to Japan, even though Japan was more than 5,000 miles away from the United States. And the only way to get to Japan was to take a boat across the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese Americans were Americans, so they obeyed the new law. That means they had to move away from their homes, away from their friends, and away from their classmates and their schools. Their moms and dads had to sell their businesses, and they lost their jobs. They had to sell their car and their house and all their things. The only thing they could keep was what they could fit in one suitcase. Then they and their families had to get on buses and move far away from their homes to a place called a concentration camp. But concentration camps were not fun places like summer camps. The concentration camps were places where they had to build their own places to live. And they could not leave if they wanted to, because the concentration camps were surrounded by barbed wire, and the people who were kept there were watched by guards with guns to make sure they didn't leave. There was one of these camps in Colorado. It was called a mache. It was freezing cold in the winter and too hot in the summer. And growing food was very difficult there because the ground was so dry. It was a hard place to live and to be with your family, because your whole home was just one small room, and you shared that small room with your whole family, and with a whole nother family that you didn't even know. The adults had to work very hard to help the United States win the war. which they did by working as farmers and growing food for the men in the army to eat. Even though life was difficult, the people forced to live at Amachi tried their best to make their lives better. They found leftover building materials from building the houses that they had to live in, and they used them to make small gardens. They built schools so their kids could keep learning. They played ball games to try to make life still seem normal. And they made beautiful art like this wood pin. They called their art gaman, which is the Japanese word for an idea. Even though this is awful, I will get through this. Well, many Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes and live in the concentration camps. Not all Japanese Americans living in Colorado were forced to be at Amachi. The Japanese Americans who already lived here before the war kept doing what they did before the war started, like farming. In Rocky Ford, the Hirakata family continued to grow cantaloupes and watermelons during the war for people in Colorado to eat. Some Japanese Americans from California and Oregon and Washington left before President Roosevelt signed that law. They chose to move to Denver to find jobs and places to live. Most places did not welcome them, but Colorado did because of our governor. Our governor, Ralph Carr, thought the Japanese Americans living in Colorado worked hard to help the people around them. He said to Japanese Americans living in other states, "If you come here, we will help you find a job, and we will welcome you here." That was very brave of him, because so many people hated the Japanese Americans during the war. But Governor Carr made Colorado a more interesting place where people could learn and grow by welcoming Japanese Americans to our state. After many battles, America won, and Japan had to quit fighting. When that happened, the United States closed Amachi, and they told all the people forced to live there that they could go home. This made them very happy. But where was home? They had sold their houses and their cars and their furniture. The moms and dads didn't have jobs anymore. Some people moved back to California or Oregon or Washington, and they stayed with friends as they started their lives over with the $25 given to them by the government. But some of them stayed in Colorado and restarted their lives here. They made new friends, celebrated Japanese culture, and started businesses, many of which, like the Pacific Mercantile grocery store in Denver, are still here today. And we keep talking about places like Amachi, so we remember to be kind to people who look or talk differently from the way that we do, and to make sure all Americans, no matter what they look like or where they come from, get to be free.